So the Russians agree not to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure. I guess that means plants that produce energy, hydroelectric plants, nuclear plants, old-fashioned oil-fired plants. But the Ukrainians weren't participating, haven't agreed, and have behaved in the opposite way. Does the U.S., as far as you know, intend to speak to Zelensky and tell him what to do?
I think Zelensky has demonstrated that he is not really responsive to what the president of the United States says. And I think that's evident also within the broader NATO framework. You now have Great Britain and France, who for all intents and purposes are telling us that they're going to press ahead on a separate avenue of approach into Ukraine. We are not in control. The president of the United States, who's commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, is not in control of all the European forces. NATO itself has broken down. It is not this alliance that is committed to unity of effort and unity of command anymore. So I think the Russians know that. They're not surprised. Unfortunately, the Europeans and Zelensky have made President Trump look silly, to be blunt.
How have they made him look silly? I mean, a lot of your colleagues on this show think he has made them look silly. He's excluded them from negotiations. They're boasting about what aid they can provide Zelensky, which they don't even have. And if they send what they have, the Russians will demolish it.
Well, he's not just the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. He's effectively the leader of the alliance. And if your alliance is no longer in step with you, and you tell them what you will or will not do, and you tell them not to do something, and I'm sure President Trump has made it very clear, we are not interested in a confrontation with Russia. You are pressing ahead with the goal of confronting Russia. That is what the British and the French want to do. However ridiculous it may appear to us, they seem to be quite serious about it. Now, can it be done? I don't know. They have to go through Germany and Poland in order to reach Western Ukraine, but they seem to be intent on doing that. So that means that the alliance is no longer responsive to President Trump. So if you're a Russian, you're looking at this and say, well, it's all fine, well, and good, whatever President Trump says, but he doesn't control the NATO alliance anymore. So we can't expect him to speak for the alliance in terms of what they will or will not do.
Colonel, what is NATO without the United States?
Well, that's the $60,000 question. I don't think it amounts to much. I haven't for a long time. And you've been to Europe many times. We all have. Europe is hardly a uniform construct. Europeans in different parts of Europe see the world very differently. If you're in Rome and you look at the world from the perspective of Italy, is Italy remotely interested in a war in Russia? Of course not. The same is true for Spain, and I would argue the same is true for Paris. And President Macron is making a serious mistake by seeing it otherwise. He's out of touch with reality and out of touch with his own population. And of course, I think the British are viewing all of this in the way that perhaps we are. What are we doing on the ground in Ukraine? That doesn't make any sense. Now, the British historically have relied on their naval power, but they're a much diminished naval power. They can't blockade the Russians. They can't control what goes in and out of Russian ports anymore. So the bottom line is NATO doesn't amount to very much without us. Now, that doesn't have to be a permanent condition. And I'm beginning to hear indications from the president and his administration that we're quite prepared to live with a new 4-star supreme commander of NATO in Mons, who is not an American, which I applaud, because at some point the Europeans have to take responsibility for themselves. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking the walk. So I think ultimately they'll end up looking ridiculous. But in the meantime, they're embarrassing us because they are theoretically led by us within the NATO framework. And that's not the way people are behaving.
Colonel, do you see any connection, whether political or emotional, between the two decisions within 2 days, one to by Donald Trump, one to unleash Netanyahu and the other to talk peace with Putin?
There is a difference, and we need to understand this. The people who are arguing to back the Greater Israel Project, even if it involves war with the United States, between Iran and the United States, Egypt and the United States, whoever in the region doesn't support the Greater Israel Project, is the following. There are some key assumptions that both Washington and the government in Jerusalem have agreed to, or essentially sign up for. Number one assumption is that the Arabs, Turks, Persians, all the Muslims in the region, in the final analysis, are cowed by us. They're afraid of us. We can bully them. We can bribe them. We can drive them in whatever direction we want them to go. Number one, they will not fight back. Number two, that as long as the United States armed forces are in the area and back Israel, that the United States armed forces, together with Israel, are invincible and invulnerable in the Middle East. And I think the third is that ultimately the rest of the world will indulge us, that everyone else will go along with it because they have no choice. Those three assumptions have not been invalidated. Thus far, if you stand back for the region and you look at it from Mr. Netanyahu's standpoint, and I think Mr. Trump shares this view, the people in the region have not fought back. They have not directly challenged the destruction, the mass murder and expulsion of people in Gaza, or presumably in the West Bank, in southern Lebanon, or anywhere else. It simply hasn't happened. And so they're right. They think they can get away with this and bully anybody. When you move to Eastern Europe, that's a different environment completely. We are not in a position to challenge the Russians militarily in Ukraine. And I think there's an awareness behind the scenes that if we try to do that, we will lose that confrontation. And so there's a willingness to do business in Ukraine that's different from doing business in the Middle East, where we think we reign supreme.
A superb analysis, Colonel. Going back to the Middle East, doesn't Netanyahu risk the existence of his country if he attacks Iran, even with the assistance of the United States?
I certainly think so. And I'm not the Lone Ranger, obviously. I think it's worse than that. I think the existence of Israel within the region is very much up for grabs at this point. You cannot tell all of your neighbors and everyone that you live with that they are subhuman animals and then expect to flip the switch on and have everyone march to your tune, whatever you're playing. So I think it's very dangerous right now for Israel. I don't think Israel's existence should be put at risk in this fashion. But I hold a minority opinion. The people in Israel that are backing Mr. Netanyahu feel very differently. They think this is their moment in the sun, that they can conquer the region, if you will, either militarily or psychologically, that everyone can be compelled to bend to them because of us. And we are now unconditionally signed up for that war if it has to be fought. And the assumption is we can win it. Again, we forget, and we've talked about this before, the Middle East is 6,000 miles from us, a long way. The logistics of the fight are very, very critical.
Right.
You cannot sustain yourself indefinitely if you get into a brawl with a large continental power like Iran. But instead of looking at the capabilities of Iran, and for that matter, the potential for the entire region to line up against you, those are things that no one will touch because they just don't believe it's possible.
So, Colonel, just as an example of the Zionists with whom the president has surrounded himself, the last time I checked, the FBI was a domestic law enforcement agency charged with enforcing federal criminal laws in the United States. You might not know that if you heard Director Patel say the following. Chris, cut number 13.
You will see what we did with Israel and the Prime Minister and our special forces and their intel operation. We will be standing side by side with them. We will shut off the machinery that feeds money into Iran. We need America to wake up and prioritize Israel. We need to bring home Americans and end this war, bring home Israelis, and make sure we stand by our #1 ally in Israel. And people need to wake up.
Is that the job of the FBI?
No, but it's a fair articulation of the attitude inside the administration. This is very much an Israel first administration. And whether or not you agree with it, it doesn't matter. Their view is that our interests and Israel's interests are identical. No, I don't think they are. I don't think they ever were. Our interests aren't really identical with very many nations around the world at all. But this is the low, what would you call it? The touchstone of membership and allegiance inside the Trump administration. So I think Cash is telling you exactly what President Trump has told him, and that is the policy of the United States. That's where we are headed. That's why we're going to have a war with Iran.
Do you share the view of Alistair Crook that the divisions in Israeli society are broad and deep and exacerbated by Netanyahu and this firing of Kash Patel's opposite number, the head of Shin Bet, will only make things worse?
Well, Alistair Crook knows a great deal more about the internal workings of Israel, and for that matter, Israel's neighbors than I do. I think there are divisions in Israel. Of that, there is no question. However, they have had these divisions in the past. And when necessary, this was true in 48. It was true in 56. There's some evidence for it in 67. Whenever they've had these divisions, they have been able to impose government's authority on everyone in Israel to ensure everyone marches in the same direction. So I think right now, while that may be true to some extent, it's not critical to the outcome. Mr. Netanyahu is firmly in charge. Let there be no doubt about that whatsoever. And he is on this path, and he will not be diverted from it.
Colonel MacGregor, thank you very much, my dear friend. Thank you for your time. Thank you for letting me take the conversation across the board, so to speak, from Washington to Palestine to Tel Aviv to Kyiv to Moscow.
I wish we could take our cold and leave it somewhere else at this point, since both you and I seem to have the same role.
Right. And I agree with you that the single malt Scotch is more effective than the Irish whiskey.
Always. I don't know what the problem is in Ireland. They just can't seem to brew really good whiskey. Now I'm sure I'll get 5,000 emails. How could you possibly say this?
Oh, God, there's a pub in my neighborhood called Jameson's. I don't know if it's an outlet of the brewer or of the distillery or what, but I don't think you'd be welcome there.
I think if somebody wanted to be shot through the face when I was growing up, all they had to do was walk into my grandfather's house and hand him a bottle of whiskey that was blended.
Wow.
You were dead on the spot. If it was a single malt, they wouldn't touch it. So